Welcome. My name is Courtney Enser. I am Vice President of Sales and Marketing here at Millcraft, and I'm really excited to share with you this special edition of the State of the Graphic Paper Industry. We really just felt like it was a good time to make sure that we connected with the community, connected with each and every one of you, and let you know that we are here to be partners as we learn and navigate these new tariff laws, the impacts, and what we see. So really excited to be able to introduce Greg Levensheimer. He is our president here at Millcraft and brings over 30 years of experience in the paper, print, and graphic communications industry. He began his career at Mead Paper. His extensive background spans the entire spectrum of manufacturing and distribution. He started in an operator role and then also was a supervisor, a trainer, capital project manager, did Lean Six Sigma Green Belt, product manager, director of operations, chief operating officer, and is now our esteemed president. In addition to his role at Millcraft, he serves as a board member of Two Sides, a member of the United States Postal Service Technical Advisory Committee, and is the immediate past chairman of the board for the National Paper Trade Association. His wealth of knowledge and leadership have been instrumental in not only shaping our company, but also our industry. We are really excited today at Millcraft to share some valuable industry news and insights in this special edition focusing on the tariff impacts. So we really appreciate you guys taking the time to join us. We know that everybody has a lot going on, and we're just really excited that we can all connect and share today. So without further ado, please take it away, Greg.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. So, hey, thank you all for joining our call today. I think we had over 350 registered attendees for this call. And so obviously, just by that response, it's, it's proving to be an important topic, right? As we, just like all of you, observe the comments from the president last Wednesday in the Rose Garden, I was immediately taking notes as he was talking, just trying to think about everything that he was saying and then trying to think second and third level effects from those fallouts. And so really, as I digested the data and started looking at things were popping out that I thought maybe were being unrepresented. And so we thought it was enough to warrant this special edition. So thank you for taking time out. My job here today is to be apolitical. I'm not talking from a Republican or a Democratic or an independent standpoint. I'm not talking red or blue, but I'm talking from an industry advocate standpoint. My job is also not to invoke fear. That's not my job, right? I'm not trying to put fear in you or the market. My job is simply to educate. Here's what I see. Here's what we know. Here's what we believe. And here are possibilities that may, come out of that. And it's really to make sure that you are all best prepared to navigate the turbulent times ahead and actually thrive in a time of apparent chaos. And so I love the fact that this is the community of folks that are combined on this call. They represent our suppliers, they represent our customers, they represent our competitors, they represent people from industry advocates, and they represent end users. And so that's what's really cool about our call, is that we get this collage of folks together. And so without further ado, let's just talk about what is the topic of the day. And so, as being a special edition, this is going to be a very different kind of format. We're going to cut right to the chase, and let's talk tariffs, right? What else really is there in the business world today? Right? It's on the top of everyone's mind. And so here's what I'd ask you to keep in mind, because it's important to have this concept in your head so that as you see things play out in the future or in the news or in the media, you'll be able to think about them maybe differently than the average person. So please remember, from Civics 101, going back to that 8th grade class that some folks may have skated by, but that the Constitution of the United States clearly calls out in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress shall have the power to basically lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So it's actually a Congress task, if you will. However, the Trump administration has declared various states of emergency. And that's the key. He's declaring these states of emergency that then give him the opportunity and grant him the power then to impose tariffs to deal with these specific threats as they've been called out. So think about in early February, it was all about the fentanyl crisis. And so it was specific tariffs that were meant to address the fentanyl crisis. You saw Section 232 talking about aluminum and steel, and that was dealing with national defense. And so, again, this is how these emergency declarations are possible. And it's also important to note that Trump did this exact same scenario in his first term. And more importantly, the Biden administration actually left those tariffs in place, almost thereby authenticating that action. And so as you think about, because this is all the talk and all the rage today in Congress is about how Congress claws back this power that they've been granted by the Constitution. And so that's the struggle that's kind of been going on here. And so it's important as we talk about everything else to have that context in the back of your head, that it's these special declarations, these emergency actions that are allowing him to have this platform for change. For those of you that pay attention and have participated on our calls in the past, you'll remember this slide. We actually shared this slide back in January, believe it or not. Feels like it's been forever ago, but we talked about these executive orders and policies that would be coming at on a fast and furious rate, but they necessarily wouldn't be unpredictable. And here's the other thing I would just say about President Trump. Go back and watch the YouTube videos of his interviews with David Letterman 35 years ago or Oprah Winfrey. He's talking about the things then that he's implementing now, and that he viewed tariffs as a tool that should have been used all along. And so this is not unpredictable, if you will. And so just take him at face value in terms of he's been talking about this for a very, very long time. And so let's talk about, more importantly, these tariffs and their impact on graphic and packaging papers. So President Trump is really focused on addressing the $36.5 million debt, the U.S. Government debt, as well as the $1.6 trillion trade deficit. And I really want to quote the words of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. For those of you, between Scott Bessent, Treasury Chair, and Howard Lutnick, those are the two that are really out in front talking about this topic in addition to the president, and they're trying to help shape the narrative, if you will. And, in the words of Howard Lutnick, to a Bloomberg reporter, he really talked about this monster, this quote unquote monster that need to be slain is the non-trade barriers that countries have used to box out U.S. goods, such as the value-added tax or the VAT tax, that they then, these countries use that tax and they then turn around and use those funds to actually subsidize their own country's manufacturing base. And so that these reciprocal tariffs, because they don't make sense, they really don't. If you look at, what's the import duties that Brazil charges us, you don't get the same answer, right? It's not a one number covers all. It's all very product, very specific. But these reciprocal tariffs were designed with that thought in mind. How do you address the totality of the barriers that have been put up? Tariffs being one of them, value-added taxes being another one, import quotas being another one. There are a variety of tools and techniques that countries have used over time. This is a very similar scenario to what Japan did with cars and Ronald Reagan did with cars, going back to the early 80s, in terms of addressing these non-trade barriers that are out in place. So when you see these numbers, and people start looking at them, and these are direct numbers right out of whitehouse.gov, right? So it's nothing that you didn't see last Wednesday, but that's how these calculations came about. It's looking at the totality of the trade deficit between that country and the United States, and dividing it by the value of the goods that transact between the two, and then taking 50% of that, basically. And so it is a long-winded way around it. So that's why you see a lot of economists talking about its approach, but it's really addressing not just the tariff rate, not just a reciprocal tariff rate if They charge 10, we charge 10, but it's looking at the totality of all the other implications, whether it's a value-added tax or some kind of import quota or some other trade barrier that exists. And so it's important to understand that because, having sat here and I talked with several customers over the last several weeks, and we talked about, what was I personally being prepared for? I was studying all the import duties for all these countries that are in play to try to understand, well, what is the duty they charge for U.S. goods for paper and paper-based packaging, figuring that was the approach. And so it's not. It's very, very different. It's important to understand those differences. So at a global snapshot view, I like images, right? It helps me get my head around it. You see that the majority of South America and Australia, they're only at 10%, which is the base rate, which is really just saying, hey, come to the table and negotiate. And then you see, the European Union being at 20%. You've got Japan and South Korea at 25%. Actually, Japan's at 26%, excuse me. You've got India at 26%. You've got Indonesia at 32%. And now you've got China not at 54 because overnight there was an escalator and they're now at 104. And so graphically, that's kind of how you should think about it. But more importantly, here's what I would say is I was on a call yesterday with the National Association of Wholesale Distributors, and their comment was that right now there's somewhere between 60 and 70 countries that have already lined up trade representatives to have conversations to understand what would it take to negotiate potentially free trade or some kind of absolute reciprocal trade agreement. And so I would say this is a very fluid situation. And as I put this graph together at 5 o'clock last night, and boom, overnight, China jumps from 54 to 104, kind of just like that. The good news, though, to take away, especially with regards to our industry and paper-based packaging and the print community, is this. And this is something that may not be understood by most because you have to kind of peel back the onion. And that's really that the tariffs that had been threatened in early February on Mexican goods and Canadian goods, remember, those were based on the fentanyl emergency executive order, right? Dealing with the fentanyl crisis. And that's why I teed up this conversation, is you got to understand the basis for which these tariffs are occurring. So it's the fentanyl crisis is how the Trump administration was talking about how to deal with Mexico and Canada, right? And there was, implementation of tariff of 2 days that began in the beginning of March, right? And all of a sudden, everyone said, hang on, we've come to an agreement and we're going to adopt this. We're going to reinstate the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canadian trade agreement, which was usurped NAFTA, right? And so the long and short of it is this, and this is important to understand, that as long as the USMCA is in effect, as long as that trade agreement is in effect, there will be no tariffs on Canadian produced printing and packaging papers, nor any of their raw materials. So like think, NBSK, Northern Bleached Softwood Kraft. Think about optical brighteners. Think about any chemicals, potash, you name it. There's a lot of components there. And so this is what caused a rapid dynamic. So if you think about what was the conversation we were having as an industry in March, it was all about these Canadian tariffs and what it was going to mean. And I was talking to several suppliers who were teed up and saying, hey, we may be producing product in the United States, but we've got a large exposure because we depend on NBSK for our pulp supply, or we depend on Canadian sourced optical brightening agents or something else, some other raw material. And so there were a lot of suppliers that were contemplating, how do I pass along surcharges to account for this, what could be a 25% escalation in cost that I can't absorb. I've got to be able to pass along in some way, shape, or form. And so remember, that was the dynamic that was happening just, it's crazy enough to believe, feels like it's been forever. But that was the dynamic. But since then, there's been an agreement. right? And so the fentanyl tariffs have come down for the time being, right? For the time being, and they've reverted back to this USMCA. And so that's important to understand. And so that's why you have not seen the effects of some of these surcharges get announced from various, domestic producers. But that's not to say that it's completely off the table, right? And so remember, we're playing the long game here, not the short game. And so it remains a risk because it's still not a settled situation. But as long as this USMCA remains in effect, right, you should feel good and comfortable about moving forward with Canadian-based products. And that's a big deal, especially with regards to things like coated mechanical and SCAs and SCA++. Those products are still available. Newsprint was going to be a huge hit because about 86% of the US market is dependent upon Canadian-based newsprint sourcing. And so that is a huge sigh of relief for the time being, right? And we'll wait to see how this plays out. Remember, this is the fentanyl tariff. However, for every what feels watch out, and that's that right now China stands alone at 104%. They are the only country that has retaliated, right? If you remember from the conversation in the Rose Garden, President Trump said, don't retaliate. Scott Bessent said, don't retaliate. Howard Lutnick said, don't retaliate. Let's negotiate. Don't retaliate, right? China stands alone. They imposed an additional tariff over the weekend. And now, overnight, the rate is now 104%. And this is a big deal. I'm not sure that even I fully understand the depth and breadth of the product lines that are going to be impacted here, because it is massive. That it's going to have a huge impact to wide format substrates, vinyls, banner material, printing plates. Think about all the press equipment, whether that's printing presses, sheet fed, roll fed. Think about all the finishing equipment. Think about all the wide format DTG, DTF products that are sourced out of China, or the components that are sourced in China. And what does this mean, right? And so it's going to likely take years to kind of unravel this one-upsmanship that's taking place. So remember, I talked about USMCA, right? USMCA took 3 years to actually negotiate, even though it was built upon top of a common understanding and a collection of agreements of NAFTA. And so think about that. You've got 3 countries that are basically get along with each other. They're building on top of an agreement. They're just modifying it. It still took them 3 years to do it. Imagine what it's going to take to negotiate with, Trump and Xi, and try to get them in a room and to get their heads around what this thing could look like. And so my only caution to you is if you're sourcing anything from China, you're going to want to take the long-term view of this. This could be a while. Do not assume that this thing is going to be over by the summer or by the end of the year. It could take a very, very long, very, very long time to unravel this component. Even though all the other countries may settle, as I said, between 60 and 70 countries are already beginning to negotiate. What does it mean for them? You've got China standing out saying, we're basically not going to be bullied. And, at some point, this is going to be a matter of principle for both Xi and Trump in terms of, who blinks. And so that's the only watch out there. But this one's going to be huge, just in terms of, if you're sourcing things, again, for your business that may not be graphic papers because there's too many countervailing anti-dumping duties, coming into the States. But this is absolutely a big one that pays to watch out. We have, though, put together kind of a 2 slides really to help. They're actually as cheat sheets, right? So if I'm a customer, what I was trying to understand is, what would I want to know, right? As I think about this and I'm thinking about the news that I'm hearing and I'm seeing the different tariff rates, how should I be thinking about my source of supply and where are those things coming from? And this is not an all-encompassing list, right? This is just some of the big hitters just to try to help our customers think about their business, right? And so you've got a variety of these grades, companies, brands, countries, and their tariff rate. And you're seeing people try to figure out how best then to pass along and or absorb some of the tariff or pass along all of the tariff, whether that's in a price increase or a surcharge. And we try to put it together a different way. So for those of you that want to take screenshots of this, please do. These slides will be available afterwards as well. But here's a different view on the same data that just says by country and the tariff rate, what companies are involved and what grades are involved. So try to do it both ways for folks. So trying to give you all a little bit of a handicapping sheet, because again, this situation is going to be fairly fluid, and it's going to be important as you think about your business, especially if I'm a printer or if I'm an end user and I'm thinking about my print job. All of a sudden I need to be concerned about the country of origin of the substrate that I'm using, because it will be meaningful, it will be material, not just for today's print job, but what if I get a reprint, or what if I need to print again in the third quarter. And so having this idea of what's made where and what the rate is, we thought might be helpful for folks. And here's the reality. The European industry is really positioned. If I think about the difference between South Korea being at 25% and European Union at 20%, is that 5% really material enough to mean that people would look one way or the other? Here's what I would tell you. This came out from Fast Markets yesterday, and that the reality is the European markets have been soft, right? And so there is absolute overcapacity in Europe right now, and they need U.S. exports. They need to be able to export products to the U.S. so they keep that industry in balance. If all of a sudden with these trade tariffs, even if they're only 20%, hard to believe that you're only saying only 20%. What does that mean to their capacity situation? What does that even mean to their economy in general? And so there's still a lot of unknowns that are out there. And there's still a lot of companies, quite candidly, that have sat on the sidelines. They're trying to determine a strategy. And, I, along with probably several in the industry, have talked to a variety of suppliers, and some of them are still in a wait and see mode, because whether they're getting counsel from, their government officials saying, hang on, we're negotiating with the administration, don't make any rash decisions, let us come to the table and see if we can't negotiate this thing down or eliminate it altogether. And so they may be waiting. You've got others that are absolutely, taking the front foot. And so we've seen a variety of price increase announcements. So Metza was really the first one. They made their announcement last Friday, basically passing on. If they got 20%, they were passing along 20%. You saw Kohler come out and talk about that they would need to, they had no way of really absorbing this increase. And you saw something very similar to this with, a lot of the South Koreans making a statement of commitment to the U.S. market, but also acknowledging that they couldn't absorb the tariff rate as it was, but that, not offering any real absolute path forward. And so a little bit, that's, Kohler's letter in my mind is emblematic of what a lot of folks are looking at. They're just trying to understand, what does this mean? And, is this a today thing? Is this a tomorrow thing? Is there with us for the next 2 years? We've also seen, Lecta just made a price increase announcement yesterday, right? So they came out with a 20%, because again, they can't absorb it either. And so you're beginning to see some of the suppliers really start to say, okay, we've got to pass this along. We really don't want to get into a situation where we're eating any of this. And I would also ask you to remember that, Lecta and others actually on allocation as it exists right now. And so think about, you're in a price escalating environment, and you've got suppliers who are on allocation. And maybe that's news to you as a customer, but yes, in fact, allocation is back in certain markets for certain grades. And so this is where it's very important for you, as if I'm a printer or an end user, I need to be thinking strategically about my supply chain and not tactically. This is not a time to be thinking about transactions. This is a time to be thinking about, What is the strategy? What is my approach? How do I protect my supply chain? Because here's a watch out for you, right? As we've dug into the data, as we've dug into the details, right? There is a serious watch out as we've read the executive order in terms of what it says, but more importantly, what it excludes. And so let me give me a moment to walk through with you what do I mean by that. So as you read the executive order from last Wednesday, right? It talks about the national emergency, right? Remember, I said up front, got to declare an emergency to give the president the power to regulate these tariffs. And so that's what he's doing in the first section, making the case for this is why this is an emergency. But then you see in section 3, talking about the implementation, and it talks about this idea of this Annex 2, and that the items, the following goods set forth in Annex 2 to this order are consistent with the law, but shall not be subject to the ad valorem rates, or basically variable rates, and of the duty under this order. Basically meaning the idea and the intent behind Annex number 2 was to list all of the goods that the U.S. depends on importing that we really don't have a good source of supply. So think about, there are some chemical elements. There's gold bullion that we really don't have in vast numbers and supplies. There's a lot of other things that we really just don't have available to us in this country in terms of natural resources that we absolutely depend on. And so they were really called out in this Annex number 2. But as we dug into the details, what jumped out at us that was listed in Annex number 2 that I know will be a problem to our industry is this. The watch out is that printed books, brochures, leaflets, and similar material, whether single sheets or folded, printed dictionaries, printed other than single sheets, newspapers, children's books, music printed, maps, globes, and the key is that 49111000, printed trade advertising material, commercial catalogs, and the like. Printed material, NESOI, not elsewhere specified or indicated. What that means, basically, it's a catch-all. Basically says any printed matter, printed on paper, in whole or in part by a lithographic process. And then the next one below that is just basically any printed matter. So what does that mean, right? Hang on. Here's the concern that as we see it, the watch out is the U.S. commercial printers need somewhere between 15 to 35% of their products need to be imported. Let's be honest, right? There's not enough supply in uncoated free sheet. There's not enough supply in coated free sheet or coated mechanical or uncoated mechanical or printing or box papers, box board. We just lack the ability to have all the supply that we need to keep up with the demand. Therefore, the print community needs to import from these countries that are subject to these tariffs, somewhere between, for the most part, 10 to 25%, right? But if print jobs are able to be imported, printed offshore with foreign source paper and labor, they would be exempt from any tariff, because that's the way they're called out in Annex 2 under the April 2nd executive order. And so this is a huge watch out, right? And so what are we doing about it, right? We're advocating on behalf of you, the customers and the print community and the industry we serve. We've already made this known to a variety of members of Congress. We've already made this known to a member of our advocacy groups and the trade associations that we're working with. We've already talked to the Graphic Media Alliance. We're talking to people at Printing Industries of America, making sure that collectively we're all advocating on behalf of our industry that we all know and love and have called home for a number of years. And so this is a huge concern, and this is a call to action for all of us as a community that depends on print. This is a loophole that we absolutely must close, right? And so the call to action here is reach out to your Graphic Media Alliance or Printing Industries of America team and understand what are they doing to advocating to get this loophole closed. Talk to a member of your member of Congress, right? Especially if your member of Congress sits on the House Ways and Means Committee. because ultimately they're the ones ultimately charged with tariffs. And so they have the power to effectively close that loophole very quickly. And so, again, that's the train wreck I see coming, because if that's allowed to occur and occur for any period of time, that could derail our industry, in total or in parts. And so we absolutely have got to address that. And so that is a huge watch out. That's a huge call to action for all of us. And honestly, this is what led us to say we need to have a special edition webinar to make sure everyone in the industry gets this fact, because it's that big, it's that material. We've got to go close that loophole. Fair enough? All right. I want to talk about the overall state of the industry in terms of the supply, because I think it's important to help you understand where we sit as a supply situation. Because if these tariffs remain in place for any period of time, because it takes a while to negotiate unraveling these tariffs and getting parties and countries to agree to certain terms, right? These tariffs could be with us for a period of time. If they are with us for a period of time, I'm here to tell you there is not enough source domestically to meet the needs of the marketplace. And so, again, I am not fear mongering. I am not telling you anything that a reasonable person couldn't come to on their own volition if they're given the same sets of data and facts. So you can see allocation potentially coming down the market in terms of certain grade categories. Coated web is going to be very, very tight between now and probably the end of the year, right? Coated sheets could get that way, especially as you see jobs potentially flipping from web to sheets. You could see that market tightening up. Don't necessarily see the uncoated market tightening up, just because for the most part, it's most of the imports that come in on uncoated free sheet are coming in from Canada. So maybe not that much, but you could absolutely see it on cut size, because there's a huge component of the cut size market that is sourced from Indonesia. So think about all the state contracts that are out there. Think about all the big box retailers. Most of those folks are dealing with an APP, an April, or someone else who's generally sourcing that product from Indonesia. That's a 26% tariff that's going to go into effect, right? I'm not sure Indonesia is at the top of President Trump's administration's call list in terms of that's who they need to settle, the trade dispute with, first. And so that one could be here for a while, which means the cut size market could absolutely tighten up. All right, so let's talk about where we are with demand. The reality is, from an apparent consumption standpoint, the markets have absolutely been fairly stable. So if I think about this top bar is uncoated free sheet, right? And so the first 2 months of the month, again, this is RISI data. We continue to appreciate their support, and we leverage that subscription to its fullest. That demand pattern is actually very consistent with the 5.5 to 5.6 million ton market that 2024 exhibited. A little bit down in coated free sheet. It's a little bit on the downward side, but there's expectation that that'll pick up here. Uncoated mechanical and coated mechanical. There's an absolute uptick in coated mechanical, especially as folks were concerned about potential Canadian tariffs, because the majority of coated mechanical is coming from Canada. And so it will be interesting to see if that volume continues to hold. Because here's the reality, right? So let's just talk about the tariff exposure by grades. The coated free sheet space is the biggest one that as I see, has the biggest exposure, especially coated sheets. And why do I say that, right? So again, a lot of times when we talk on this call, we're talking in terms of, big generalities. Coated free sheet, what does coated free sheet consist of? It consists of both web or rolls and sheets, whether they're folio sheets, digital sheets, right? And so you've got to really peel back the onion a little bit to understand that, the number says it's only 38% of coated free sheets need to come in from, imported channels. But the reality is, as you peel it back just one layer deeper, right? The reality is the coated free sheet web market, 90% of that market is domestically sourced. So it's about 870,000 tons. So that means that if it's that much more domestically sourced on web, imagine how much imports we rely on sheets. That number's like 75%. So 75% of coated free sheets, whether they come in whether they come in cartons or skids or digital or folio, 75% of coated sheets are sourced from imported means, whether that means Europe, whether that means South Korea, whether that means Brazil, whether that means, wherever, right? So that is a huge watch out. And so that's why I say, as you think about the coated market, coated web is already fairly tight just because of some, certain suppliers, supply constraints. And so you're seeing certain suppliers announce, that they're on allocation on coated web. You're likely to see the scenario is not that unlikely, I should say, that you could see, allocation as we move towards the summer months with regards to coated free sheets, right? And so that's really how you get to that level of about 1.7 million. So, if you're, you depend on coated sheets in whether it's folio or digital sheets, that's a huge watch out for you to be concerned with it. Please make sure you're doing your due diligence. So ensure that you've got a stable source of supply. As I talked about, on the uncoated free sheet, I know sometimes I only talk about those two, which is really because of the biggest components of the market, at least that we deal with at Millcraft, right? This piece is really aimed at cut size. A huge portion of the uncoated free sheet market in cut size comes from imports. A lot of the folios are, generally speaking, domestically sourced. And so where will you see potential tightness in the uncoated free sheet market? It could be in cut size, again, just because, as I said, a lot of that comes from Indonesia. And think about second level effects. And what do I mean by that? Well, if all of a sudden China's got 104% tariffs and South Korea's got 25% tariffs and Indonesia's got 26 to 32% tariffs, what does that mean for all the steamship lines? Where do they see import volumes coming into the United States, right? Where are they going to put their vessels? And more importantly, and this is a little known fact, right? There's another clause in the Chinese tariff that is meant to address the U.S. shipbuilding industry. And so, I think for those of you that watched the Trump addressing Congress back in February, he made the comment about the need for the U.S. to rebuild its ship producing capacity. One of the elements in the Chinese tariff that was just announced is this idea that any Chinese built ship, right, that enters a port of call in the U.S. could be subject to $1 million port of call fee. So think about what that means. China is the largest shipbuilder in the world. So it doesn't matter if I am bringing in product from Europe, but if it's on a vessel that was originated in China, built in China, all of a sudden there's $1 million port of call fee that could potentially be put in place. So that's the second level effect that I talk about, that, again, a lot of folks haven't dug in deep enough to say, hang on, there's other things here than what just at the surface meets the eye. And so please, please, please be aware of that fact as well. And that's why navigating these turbulent times, it's very important that you've got a partner who's absolutely advocating on your behalf. Because here's the reality: you look at the imports of coated free sheet and uncoated free sheet. Yes, they have absolutely moved up. Yes, they're back to their long-term levels. But the reality is, it's in 90 days they're going to be gone, right? That if I look at the volume that's there, if these tariffs remain in place and their subsequent replenishment are delayed because of the price increase and potential lack of demand and or whatever else, you could see those imports dry up fairly quickly, and or maybe they just pass along the price increase and everybody absorbs it and everyone moves on. And that's really because of, we talked about this when we were together in January. There's been just so many closures of U.S. manufacturing that it's really made it to the point where we absolutely depend on foreign sources. Because the reality is, domestically, there's only 30 days of inventory of uncoated free sheet, and there's only 46 days of inventory in coated free sheet. And remember, that's based on what are fairly weak demand levels, right? So those are relative numbers. Those aren't absolute. On an absolute basis, it's some of the lowest all-time numbers in terms of what's absolutely in inventory in those categories. So again, my job is never to invoke fear. It is to educate, right? And to give you something to think about, right? So here's what I would say. What are my, my prescription for success? First of all, it's this. Please advocate. We've got to close that Annex 2 loophole that prevents basically an uneven playing field in the U.S. printers, right? So that they're not competing against foreign source print that has zero impacts from tariffs. I truly believe now is a point of partnership, right? You've got to develop trust with a supply chain partner who's got your best interest involved. Look at supply agreements. As I've traveled around and talked to printers, I am shocked at all the printers that have supply agreements with their customers, but don't have supply agreements for their source of supply. And that blows my mind. How can you make commitments to deliver goods when you don't have a commitment or guaranteed source of supply? And so just ask you to consider, is now the time to be looking at a supply agreement? Because this idea of, transaction only mindset will get you in trouble, right? Collaborate. Do you know your source of supply? Do you know where that's coming from? Do you know the country of origin? Do you know, what's the likelihood that I'm actually going to get this thing passed on to me and I've got to absorb it? And that remember that 75% gap in coated sheets. And what does that mean? I'm asking you to think deeper and think longer term. It took 3 years to negotiate USMCA. It's going to take years for the parties to get all this to play out, right? Across all the countries that, this industry depends on. Think about how you source equipment. What equipment are you looking at to potentially buy to help your business? Is it sourced from China, or are there components sourced from China? Man, I would want to know, because again, I may be able to get that thing, and maybe that product is already sitting in the States. But what happens when I need to go get service and go get parts and they're made in China? Am I going to all of a sudden have my parts that are priced out of the market? Again, those are the things that I'm asking you to think deeper, think over the long term. You've got to evaluate your market approach. Do you need to review your pricing with your customers? I'm shocked by how many people have price locks with their customers. Now's not the time to be doing that, right? How do you handle surcharges? How are you going to handle surcharges? Do you potentially need to declare force majeure? Do you have that capability of doing that, right? How do you decomplexify, your paper requirements? Do you need to move from a making environment to a stock environment to a house sheet environment that that you can source? And very similar to the allocation market of 2022, it was the folks who had guaranteed source of supply. They were the ones that thrived during that time period versus the ones that maybe had a great number but couldn't buy anything because it wasn't available, right? I'm not telling you that's coming. I'm just telling you those are the things that I see on the horizon, right? Those are the things that I see absolutely on the horizon. And then the last is I always talk about visibility. If you've got a supply chain partner, man, sharing what you know sooner rather than later is better, right? Do you have a point of sale, or do you have demand patterns that you're looking at? Are you providing each other with forecasts or inventory levels? And are you looking at system to system integration so that you make sure that you can see your supply chain fairly quickly? Those are the recipes for success in my mind, as you think about some of these challenges. Because here's the one point of certainty with regards to tariffs, and this is a fact. Not everyone's going to handle these in the exact same way. These aren't necessarily just price increases, right? So there's no single way that these things are going to get passed along. Some may choose to implement it as a price increase. Some may put them as a surcharge. Some may absorb some and pass along, any excess in the way of an increase or a surcharge. And so the reality is that every supplier, every distributor, Every customer is going to need to determine how best they can absorb or pass along any financial impact from these tariffs. And it's really going to be based on the technology that they have available to them, right? And the supplier base they have access to, and the markets that they call on, right? And so that is the one thing for certain. So the way the Millcraft handles things is probably not the way that Midland or Lindenmeyer or Veritiv or Athens or Central Michigan Paper, we're all going to handle it differently based on our own individual sets of circumstances. And so that's just a heads up. That's not necessarily a watch out. That's just the reality of the situation. So making sure we call that out in front, that these are going to be different times, because we've not all been through this like this before. And there's absolutely some complexities to think about. And I know this is full of verbiage, and we will, as I said, we will get this out to you. I think these are wonderful thought starters for you to be thinking about your business with your executive team to say, what if? How should we be thinking about this, right? When will companies be forced to raise prices? You've already seen a handful of them get enacted. I know that there are others that are simply taking a wait and see approach. They're going to wait potentially 2 weeks or a month and evaluate, because they know it may take several months for their products to get to market, right? And if you want to know more about when tariffs are due, right, we can have that conversation one-off. I can help you understand that, because that's a component to it as well. When does inventory get escalated? So if there's a price increase, you implement the price increase today, because there's going to be an expectation, probably likely, that if the tariff gets removed, customers are going to say, well, I want to buy at the new non-tariff rate. And so are you thinking about that? Do you implement the price increase immediately so that you can have the capability then of letting it, reverting it when the circumstances arise, right? Each leg of the supply chain is going to have very different dynamics as well. How are each merchant partner, how are they going to deal with it? What if it ships direct from the mill? How are you going to raise prices as a printer? If I'm a web printer who buys more direct, do I need to raise prices faster because I don't have an inventory buffer in there, right? How much inventory are you sitting on? How are you evaluating that, right? How will print buyers make choices? If they think about, are they going to source from one source because it may be historically it may be cheaper? I guarantee you, cheaper is not more sustainable here over the near term, right? And what happens if this all gets rolled off in 6 months, or if it stays 3 years? As I talked about, it took 3 years to negotiate USMCA. More importantly, what should I say to a print buyer who asks, well, should I wait till tomorrow, right? I've got this print job, because there's no doubt there's a lot of print demand that's sitting on the shelf, right? There's a lot of pent up demand everyone's been waiting for this spring to finally be sprung of demand of, we saw manufacturing really, tick up in February. And, even though, expected inflation rates and
manufacturing
may have slowed a bit in March, the jobs number actually improved in the month of March. And so there may be some pent up print demand that's out there. And so what should you be talking to your print buyers about? Should they wait, right? Normally, maybe waiting makes the difference, but maybe not this time, right? Maybe, waiting to make a decision may not be in your best interest. And again, that is on an individual case by case basis. And again, this is where I'm hoping that if I'm a printer, that you're going on the front foot, right? That you're saying, I don't know everything, but I know something. And I know this is how we're going to deal with things. Here's how we're going to manage things. And we're going to go get to the market, because the market is absolutely looking for safe harbor. They're trying to understand, so what does this mean to me, right? And what are the things that I can do to protect myself, but to potentially help me thrive when my industry peers may be seeing this as a challenge, right? So let's be honest. Here's how Millcraft's going to handle any tariffs, being very clear up front. If our suppliers simply raise price, we're just going to adjust pricing. However, if there's a surcharge added, we're going to add those as a surcharge line item, right? And so it is not a matter of, is this open for negotiation? Unfortunately, this is the way we're going to handle them, and here's why, right? But the good news is that even if there's a surcharge, we're going to be able to quote you. The technology that we put into place, right, is that if I'm talking to a CX representative on the phone at Millcraft, they're going to be able to quote you an all-in number. If I'm going on EDI, I should be able to see that number as well. If I'm going on my Millcraft, you'll be able to see that. And so we are going to quote you that all-in number up front. You're just going to see it broken out differently when it finally comes to the invoice, but it'll roll up to the same number we quoted you up front. And there was a reason behind that, right? Because surcharges, because they are a tax, right? They are a tax. They are a tariff that we're passing through, right? They're going to be exempt from prompt pay discounts. They're going to be exempt from any, customer incentives and any year-over-year volume analysis that say, did you grow last year? Well, there's a 25% tariff. How did you not spend more with me this year than last year? And so that's the decision we've made internally to make sure that we're dealing with this to make the most sane business decision, given a little bit of the insanity that's going on around us. Just know this, that Millcraft is absolutely advocating on your behalf. We still have a $100 in-stock guarantee. We still have what I believe is the most durable, kind of best domestic set of suppliers, as well as the most sustainable global set of suppliers, whether that's meaning they're sourced from Europe, they're sourced from South America, or they're sourced from Asia. I believe we've got an incredible lineup of partners that can help you. And again, this is where a great merchant earns its keep, right? And we talk about this all the time at Millcraft. Our job at Millcraft is to protect our customers' supply chains. And this is exactly, what we intend to do during these turbulent times, starting with something as simple as, educating folks along the way. In summary, right? Trade tariffs are going to be very disruptive. They are. I can't sugarcoat that. U.S. producers lack sufficient supply to meet all the demands required of both the graphic and the packaging grade space. This idea of this Annex 2 loophole, as an industry, we've all got to collectively advocate. It's all in our best interest to get that loophole closed, right? We can't put the U.S. commercial printing industry at risk of having folks work around that. These Chinese tariffs especially, they could be here for an extended period of time. So you need to plan on that potential reality. So think about what that means into wide format substrates and banner stands and wide format equipment and parts and different kinds of components. Partner transparency right now is the only proven solution, right, that overcome these market forces that you could see another bullwhip effect coming because of supply and demand being being altered here. And that ultimately Millcraft remains committed to providing our customers with world-class supply chain strategy and leveraging our supply chain and the technology investments to really advantage our customers. So that's all the prepared remarks. We did get one question, and thanks to the folks at JBM Packaging, they submitted a question. I thought it was a great one. And the question is, anticipation, and we won't see much in terms of tariff surcharges given the mill system that we buy from being domestic. The biggest concern is the import volume shifts back to domestic and cause constraints that create price increases and allocations like that was happening in 2022. Curious to see if Greg agrees that, being more likely the outcome of the policy, assume it stays in place longer. I know the imports had generally trended up in the last 12 to 18 months for uncoated. What I've heard, the grapevine sounds like that's the case for specialty grades as well. Absolutely. So you saw this uptick in imports. First of all, I appreciate the fact that you raised this question in advance to give us a chance to, think about, the best concise answer. Yes, imports have built up, right? But don't get, I would ask you to be cautious over the statement, well, I'm domestically sourced, right? And if I've got Domtar or Sappi or, Sylvamo or Pixel, then I'm good because I've got those guys and they're all domestically sourced and they're not gonna see tariffs. They won't, given the set of circumstances as they exist today. But remember, it wasn't that long ago, back in early March, that under the fentanyl right? Emergency declaration, Canada was going to get a 25% tariff. That, in fact, would have impacted every one of those domestic suppliers in one way, shape, or form, whether it's because of the pulp that they may be needing to buy from Canada, or a subcomponent, or optical brightener, or some kind of chemical. They were all going to feel in some way, shape, or form the effects of that Canadian tariff. If USMCA stays in effect, absolutely, most of the domestics are going to be held, fairly constant. Now, what that doesn't mean though is if all of a sudden the imports prices increase and they leave the market, you can expect supply and demand to absolutely come into play, and that there may be price increases just because needing to keep supply and demand kind of in somewhat in balance. And so I know it's a long-winded answer to what sounds like a fairly simple question, but there's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, I appreciate that question. And then Robert or Courtney, what other questions do we have that maybe came in via the chat?
Hello. Earlier in the chat by Lee, she asked if the PowerPoint would be available to download. And Courtney already answered that, saying yes, probably within a week we'll have the recording available. And you answered the question about yes, that these PowerPoint presentations will be available.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, generally speaking, we hold these webinars kind of behind our firewall for a period of time, for about a month, to allow our customers to have an advantage. We're not going to do that this time. It's only going to be about a week, and then it's going to be out on YouTube, because we believe it's for the good of the overall industry, that this issue transcends all of us. Are there any other questions, Robert?
Not at this time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to, I'll turn on the mics. You can come on mic, or if you are shy to jump on mic, feel free to type it out in the chat box here in our webinar.
Awesome. We answered all the questions up front, or we've scared the bejeepers out of people.
Hi, Greg. This is Bill Prettyman from Wise. Where will cut size be produced if the tariffs go into effect? What's going to happen? How will cut size get to the market?
Great question, Bill. Good, and thanks for joining us. So, Bill, you raise a great point. So, cut size. Think about all the big box retailers. For the most part, they move the majority of the volume in the cut size space. A lot of that is absolutely sourced from Indonesia, and Indonesia absolutely got hit between the eyes, and just in terms of their current tariff rate. And so you could see now there may be a lot of supply, because that is one market that is fairly efficient, just because of those big box retailers tend to order in advance. They're all coming up on school bid season, right? So they may be stockpiling the barn, so they may not pass along any pricing increases here in the first half of the year. But as those stockpiles begin to dwindle, you could envision a scenario where to replenish those stockpiles, it's going to be produced at a tariff rate of, what is it, 30%, 28%? Trying to remember off the top of my head what Indonesia gets. And so that could be absolutely meaningful and material, and you may see people domestically be able to match that number. And so you may see more cut size be produced in the States, which to all the folks that are produce cut size, they're probably excited about that fact. And then really it's a matter of, does Brazil and settle the trade tariff issue, because they're only at a 10% rate, and do they take advantage of that situation? My concern for the European Union is, and this is not a political argument at all, it's the reality. The European Union right now does not speak with a singular voice, right? Because you have all these countries that are trying to speak on behalf of their individual needs, but they're trying to make sure that that's understood, when it gets to the Hague and into Brussels, and so that they're speaking as European Union as one. And that's a challenge right now. And so that's part of the dynamic. And so as I think about, all the tariffs that are announced, China is the furthest one out. The European Union is going to be hard to wrangle just because, again, getting them to speak with a singular voice, and to negotiate as one could be problematic. What I don't know is what's the order in which the Trump administration is going to go talk to all 60 or 70 countries, right? Who goes first? Is there a pecking order? So I know it's a long-winded way of answering, Bill. Right now, I would just tell you it's probably too early to feel the effects in the cut size market. But once folks start realizing what does this mean for replenishment orders, it will absolutely come into play. And so a question some may ask is, so when are tariffs applied? And it's really the moment the container ship closes its doors at the last port of call before it heads to the United States. Meaning if, like we had a scenario where we had one vessel that we were importing from China, one got out at 10 o'clock in the evening. It was not exposed to the tariff. We had another one that got out at 2 in the morning. It was exposed to the tariff just because of when the doors basically closed and when they disembarked from port. That's the moment the tariffs are applied, right? But that also applies, and it's a point of granularity, but it's real. If that ship has multiple ports of call, it's the last port of call. It's the disembarkation, the last port of call before it gets to the United States. So even though your vessel may have left 15 days ago ahead of all these tariffs, doesn't matter. If all of a sudden their last port of call was in Iceland, and now all of a sudden they're disembarking out of Iceland, they're headed to the States with the last portion of their load, they will get the tariffs. And so that's why I say don't get comfortable if your ship left 15 days ago. It's really a matter of that last point of disembarkation. So I know a lot of information there. Probably sorry, Bill, and feel free to call me, Bill, if you want to talk more.
No, Greg, I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. 32% for Indonesia. So it's a big number. Other questions?
Greg, this is Bill Prettyman again. Since there are not any other questions, I'll just ask one more. So do you foresee anything like this if you're looking long term? Do you see commercial printers purchasing roll sheeters to go on their seed fed process?
Potentially, yes. Especially for custom size work. You're kind of seeing that a little bit. Think about all the inkjet presses that are out there. And so, that is absolutely, can take obviously some big steps out of the supply chain. But unfortunately, for the most part, a lot of those inkjet presses, their origin is China. Whether those are individual components or in totality. And so that's just something to be mindful of as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions? And hearing none, obviously, please reach out to your Millcraft rep. Please reach out to Just Ask at Millcraft. We're here for a dialogue, right? We're in for this for the long term. We're a 105-year-old company. We are taking the long-term approach here, and we're trying to make sure that we're protecting the interests of all of our customers and the graphic arts industry in total. So hopefully you found this valuable. Like I said, if there are other questions or comments, please let's continue the dialogue. Courtney, Robert, let you guys wrap it up.
We did just have another question come in. You mentioned the possibilities of the 1 million port to call fee for Chinese chips. Is that something that is still being discussed, or is that coming?
So that is, in my understanding, that is still open for discussion at this point. I'm not seeing it enacted. Honestly, the first time that I heard it was about 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. That part of one of the orders was considered to be this port of call fee. So we will absolutely get clarity around that, and we'll put something out to that effect in terms of if this is a genuine concern or not? Thank you for asking that question. It's a great point of clarity.
Okay, if nobody else has any other questions, we will have this video available on YouTube as soon as possible. We will send a message out to everybody here once that video is live, so you can rewatch it and share it with all of your colleagues and friends. The notes for the PowerPoint presentation will also be available. We'll send that to you guys shortly as well. Probably expect a few days for that as well. Thank you everybody for joining this webinar about the industry update on tariffs. And everybody have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks all.